Hello and welcome to the Headache Doctor podcast, where on this podcast, it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. In today's podcast, we're going to be talking about historical figures with headaches. And it's going to be interesting because we're going to take these historical well-known figures that you probably didn't know suffered with the same types of symptoms that you may be struggling with. And we're gonna talk about them as if they were patients at Novera and how we would interact with them and help them out. On this podcast, once again, we have Dr. Thomas. Thanks for being on the podcast again, Dr. Thomas.
Super happy to be here. This is a fun one for me.
Yeah, and she did all the research, so I can't take any credit for that. I'm just gonna kind of step into, okay, if Julius Caesar was a patient at Novera Headache Center, what would we do with this information? One of the things that we want you to take away from this conversation is the fact that these people had these debilitating symptoms, but were still able to accomplish a lot. There were names, their household names that, were able to have a big impact on the world. I mean, positive or negative. We're not necessarily going to get into that stuff. We're just going to talk about them, their lives, and what we know of at least is their symptoms. So maybe we start off, let's number one, Julius Caesar. I think that's first, right?
Yep, Julius Caesar is number one. So I assume most people know quite a bit about Caesar, but I figured I'd give just a really brief overview. And I do just want to say really quick before we get started, we are not a history podcast, and these are, extremely complex lives. So please do not send us emails if we gloss over the details of your favorite historical figure. We're just here to give a little bit of context. So Julius Caesar, Roman dictator, so very famous for expanding Rome's power in Europe. He helped Cleopatra consolidate Egypt. He famously took control of the Senate and basically ended the Roman Republic. He was kind of set up a dictatorship in Rome that would go on for hundreds of years. An interesting fact about him is he actually introduced us to the modern calendar, which I thought was kind of cool. So even today, this guy's about 2,100 years old. He was born in 100 BCE. So 2,100 years later, we're still feeling his effects. Now, Julius Caesar is an interesting one. He suffered from what might have been diagnosed as epilepsy. It's hard to say. I went into the kind of deep dive of the research, and it really is unclear what he suffered from, if it was hypoglycemia, epilepsy, but his symptoms, he suffered from seizures, repetitive headaches, and just a lot of kind of what we would describe as neurological symptoms at this point. So he actually famously was in the Senate about to take control of the Senate and suffered from a seizure. So pretty serious, and it got worse as he grew older. And again, causes are somewhat unclear as to what he was suffering from.
Is it true that the term seizure came from Caesar?
I don't know. I actually did not look into that. Spelled differently.
That was just a bad joke.
And I was taking it seriously. I don't know. I'm like, I didn't look it up.
Anyways, moving on. You had mentioned earlier that there were thoughts that he had potentially a brain tumor or something like that.
That came up as well. Like I said, the research is all over the place as to what Caesar might have suffered from. Like I said, I saw hypoglycemia, I saw epilepsy, seizures. But yes, it was maybe postulated that he might have had a brain tumor as well, especially that may have developed a little bit later in life.
Okay, so if Julius Caesar came in and he had those symptoms, what would we do here at Novera Headache Center? Well, were you going to say something?
You looked like you were asking, so I was going to answer, but you can go for it.
Well, no. Now I'm going to give you the platform.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So telomeres do tend to be pretty rare. Most of our patients have had all the imaging in the world before they come and see us. So tumors are pretty much like our medical system should catch that one before. Now, that being said, if you do happen to come in and you haven't gone to a single doctor, some things we're going to watch out for is really constant pain. So tumors are always present. It's not like they're growing and coming back and going away and coming back. So the pain's going to be pretty constant, dull ache. A lot of cancer signs in general tend to be red flags, such as trouble sleeping, unexplained changes in weight. You can have some of the neurological symptoms as well that Julius Caesar suffered from. So really serious symptoms that we don't tend to see in our clinic.
Yeah. So a few things that stand out. Age. So I think it was later on in life. Mm-hmm. So that's one of them. A new onset of a headache later on in life puts you in a higher risk category. Now, that said, we see a lot of people that, later on in life that get new headaches. So it doesn't like guarantee you, oh, there's something dangerous here. The other thing is it was accompanied by seizures and other neurological signs. Now, when we say other neurological signs, like we're not necessarily talking like numbness and tingling or even like slurred speech, sensitivities, lights and sounds, although those things they do qualify as neurological signs. Like a seizure is something that we have not seen this neck problem cause. I haven't personally seen that yet. That would be something that's outside of the norm of what we're used to seeing. So his presentation would be a little bit of like, okay, we need to take some more tests and measures to make sure like we're not missing something before we move forward with treatment. But yeah, I mean, he very well could have had some sort of a neck issue that was contributing to the head pain itself, because we don't always want to assume just because there is other neurological signs that someone doesn't have a neck issue that's contributing to the headache itself. So it can be a little bit of a both and. So let's say there is a scenario where someone had a headache and then they found out they had a tumor. It doesn't mean they didn't have a neck problem that was contributing to the headache. Anyways, it might be a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, there's Julius Caesar and how we would interact with him.
Send him to the neurologist.
Yeah. So who's next?
Okay. So we have 4 next. So I kind of grouped these ones together. All of them are likely at least somewhat related to traumatic brain injury. So we do tend to see traumatic brain injury sometimes in our clinic. Obviously, people play sports, people might fall, car accident is another big one. So these 4 are Henry VIII, Harriet Tubman, Elvis Presley, and Mary Todd Lincoln. So just to give you just a brief overview of those 4. So Henry VIII ruled in England, really infamous ruler in England is probably the best way to put him. He had 6 wives. He beheaded 2 of them, set up the English Reformation, So he basically set up the church in England, mostly so he could divorce his first wife. But like I said, very controversial figure. And I found him very interesting because there were some recent studies that they did. So when he was a kid, he was very sweet and very intelligent and kind. And by the end of his life, he was very overweight. He had memory problems. He was really aggressive. He would kind of execute anyone at the drop of a hat. And I found a study that said he might have actually suffered from some sort of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is something pretty commonly seen in football players where they just get chronic repetitive injuries, so from sport type activities. And they postulated that Henry VIII actually might have been in this category, that he suffered a number of injuries while jousting, hiking, riding, hawking, I believe they refer to it, but falconry. He suffered a lot of head injuries that might have contributed to this kind of decline, these headaches, this mental decline, etc. So that's number 1. Give me
comments on that. Yes. If someone has repeated head injuries and they have a change of personality, so if we're thinking of, again, so going back to Julius Caesar, like we can have both and. Like if someone's going through repeated head traumas, they are likely also experiencing trauma to their neck. Okay, so there's an impact it has on the brain itself. And CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is something that's kind of still being understood. The impact of the brain over that long period of time. And so to say like definitively diagnose someone with CTE now is challenging, let alone Henry VIII.
500 years ago.
Yeah. And so hard to say, but a personality change past what would be seen as like, my mood has changed, I'm easily agitated, things that would make sense if someone's in pain all the time. We see that all the time. So it's not just like, well, I'm not the same person. Like people all the time tell us they're not the same person. But like these types of behaviors that are like this person literally changed after these head traumas, that would be a little bit different than just like a migraine, neck tension, angry neck type of a symptom. I mean, potentially if he was just in pain all the time and just like really angry and I mean, he had the power that he had. So, I mean, I guess there is an avenue where someone that's just in chronic pain, it could act out like that. But I think there's probably something deeper there where the brain was actually impacted along with very likely his cervical spine from repeated traumas.
Yeah, that's what it kind of sounded like in the research as well, is they think that maybe this big personality shift might have been from all of that repeat trauma. And of interest with him, we talk about family connections quite a bit and how, just because your family has migraines doesn't necessarily mean you will, but you do tend to inherit your anatomy from your family. So Queen Elizabeth I was his daughter, and she also did suffer from headaches. I wasn't able to find much about that one, aside from the fact she was using lavender to cure it, which was kind of interesting from a homeopathic remedy. But there does appear to at least have been maybe a bit of a predilection there as far as anatomy goes, because he did pass that on to his daughter.
Interesting.
So,
Interesting.
I found that one really interesting.
Yeah. And so with passing on headaches, migraines, I mean, the connection physically, I mean, you inherit your mom and dad's anatomy, maybe their postures, their habits, things that you have in your own life have led to you experiencing, or at least having a higher risk of experiencing headaches or migraines. Maybe you pass it down to your kiddo. So some interesting stuff there.
Yeah. I found those ones. And then going along with a few more traumatic brain injuries, I'll just give these ones quick. So Harriet Tubman, very famous abolitionist, conductor on the Underground Railroad. So she was able to save, I think, 70 people from slavery on her own, and then assisted in a lot more. She was also a spy and a scout during the Civil War. She famously suffered from headaches after being struck by an overseer. She was hit with a weight while trying to defend another slave, it sounded like. So she famously suffered from seizures and migraines as well throughout her life. She actually had brain surgery without anesthesia later in life, which I thought was a little bit scary. But we do talk about surgery, not necessarily brain surgery, but we do talk about surgery kind of being a last-ditch effort at times. So I found that one kind of interesting as well.
So this theme of seizures with migraines, yeah. I think I'd just go back to any sort of head or neck trauma. The thing that our healthcare system does well is, I guess, in a sense, consider the impact on the brain or the head where the actual, trauma occurred. Those are things that we can generally see. I mean, nowadays we can do imaging and understand, like if there's a skull fracture or something like that, we can even see bleeding or swelling around the brain. The something that's harder to see is the impact on the biomechanics of the neck. Like, how does the neck respond to these things? And it's almost always going to be there. There's going to be some impact on the neck. And so, again, in that scenario, even though there's like seizures involved, it very well could be that her neck is also experiencing some level of tension irritation that's sending that pain signal, causing the head pain itself, as opposed to it being just like, oh, she had a head injury, so this is just a head problem. Yeah.
I found that one very interesting. And yeah, I mean, if it was lifelong, you would think there was something repetitive with the anatomy. Like I said, some sort of an injury or a tightness that lasted. I agree with that as well, that, it's not going to last your whole life typically. I
almost wonder, hearing these two cases, if seizure could have been interpreted as what our audience would experience as a migraine, like those migraine symptoms, like debilitating pain, a visual disturbance, even people having like slurred speech. I wonder if that could have been interpreted as like, oh, that's a seizure. Maybe there's just a difference in like language now compared to when this was being documented.
Yeah, I think that's very much a possibility. Obviously, one thing, I didn't say this up front, but it's very hard to diagnose people. A lot of times the medical records are incomplete, if there are any to begin with. And they talked about some figures really didn't want their medical history getting out, so they would really censor it, or that sort of thing. So yeah, no, I think that's very much possible at this point, that maybe what we would call a seizure is maybe not what they would have referred to as seizure. So yeah, I think that's very possible.
Yeah. Who else we got?
Okay, so Mary Todd Lincoln and Elvis, I'll just put together quick. Not a lot on Mary Todd Lincoln. She was a lifelong migraine sufferer. She did hit her head in a carriage at one point, kind of later in life, and that did kind of exacerbate her headaches. But other than that, not a lot on her. Elvis is an interesting one I want to talk about for a little bit of a different reason. So traumatic brain injury also did contribute to his headaches. He had a number of fights, actually, a couple of hits in the head from fists. He was roller skating and fell. And then he also tripped and fell in his house, and I think was unconscious for a fair amount of time. But the reason I wanted to talk about Elvis, we've already kind of covered the traumatic brain injury, but his diet was very interesting. He had kind of an infamously carb heavy and fat heavy diet. I was reading right before this, one of the sandwiches he enjoyed eating was called a fool's gold loaf, which is a hollowed out sourdough loaf. And then you fill it with an entire jar of peanut butter on one side, an entire jar of jam on the other side, and a pound of bacon in the middle. It's about 8,000 calories, which which is kind of an insane sandwich, but we talk a lot about the effects of sugar, especially on migraines and caffeine and everything as well. But I thought that would be an interesting one from a diet standpoint. He had probably one of the worst diets of all time.
Yeah, that's nuts.
It sounded great. I'm not going to lie. It sounded delicious.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just going down this is a good blend of like the physical side of things, right? So oftentimes when we're trying to evaluate someone's headache or migraine situation, we try to find the one thing, right? Like, why do I have this headache or migraine? When really like sure, there might be a thing that triggered them, meaning you got hit in the head or multiple times to cause the actual trauma. And by the way, you don't have to have any head or neck trauma. Plenty of people that we interact with that have headaches or migraines don't have like a history of head or neck trauma. But what happens after you have that trauma and like how the environment that pain is experienced in, so your neck has a problem, you have pain. This is where we get in the conversation of triggers. So Elvis would have been, I don't know, I don't think we have necessarily the information to say this was a real thing, but let's say you had one of those 8,000 calorie sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly bacon sandwiches, and then that would be like a trigger because of the high level of sugar or maybe even gluten, or whatever it was, like increased, like his body didn't respond well to that. And I mean, you probably don't need to go into it much to say like the body wouldn't respond well to that. And so it would reduce his ability to tolerate whatever's happening in his neck. So like inflammation throughout his body goes up, and then his body's more sensitive to what he's feeling in his neck. And that's where oftentimes people, you know, I don't know if anyone actually eats that 8,000 calorie sandwich anymore.
I hope
Hopefully not. But and then they'd say, well, that's my trigger, and they'd, you know, remove gluten or remove sugar, and that would probably help. And they say, well, mine's a diet issue, but it's not a diet issue in isolation. It's just that you're improving your health in that way and kind of removing that trigger, but there's still a neck issue. So I think that's a good example of like how both can be true.
Yeah, I thought that one was really interesting. Just again, you know, it obviously wouldn't have removed the root cause of the headache, but I at least thought, you know, probably if he'd eaten a little bit healthier, it might have helped the headache itself. So yeah. Next two on our list, actually next three, are artists. I found this one really interesting. So headache with aura is a really common thing that we see and tends to be kind of a visual disturbance. So you may or may not have a headache with it, but you get a lot of like flashing lights and kind of weird squiggles in your vision, all sorts of visual disturbances. And there's actually evidence. So Van Gogh and Monet are two impressionist painters. If anyone's familiar with impressionism, and I'm not an art expert, so please do not email me if I get this wrong, but impressionism is basically kind of more of an abstract form of painting that became popular about 200 years ago, give or take, maybe about 150 actually. And it's a lot more like kind of dots and swirls and everything. And they actually think both Van Gogh and Monet had migraines with aura. And they think that might have impacted sort of how they saw the world and might have impacted their painting style. So, you know, you're seeing all these weird dots and streaks and flashes, and you might start painting dots and streaks and flashes instead of, you know, the very standard portrait of the time that was very realistic. So I found that interesting. The other one is Lewis Carroll, very famous for writing the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, sort of. I think it's at least 2 books. There might be a few more. He wrote a lot of visual disturbances. Anyone who's read Alice in Wonderland is familiar with things changing size and things being distorted. And they actually think that might have been somewhat, you know, impacted or influenced by his headaches with aura.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So there you go. You can channel this this very debilitating symptom, because oftentimes the aura that someone experiences, our patients will tell us like that is the major thing that they want to see go away, even more so than the pain. You can just maybe become a world famous painter if you've ever thought about that.
Write a horrible series of books.
Yeah. Right.
I don't like Alice in Wonderland. That's just a personal thing.
Yeah, maybe a little bit odd in parts.
Just a bit.
Yeah, I don't think I've never experienced an aura, but I'm sure that there are people listening to this that are connecting with that and like, oh, I could probably see that happening. I don't know if there's anything clinically there to go over. I mean, aura itself is going to be, so think of your brain as experiencing this really intense pain signal, and that the pathway that pain signal is traveling on, it interacts with a few different things before it actually gets to the brain. The brain's where the cortex of the brain is where it actually interprets what's happening. And so it goes through these different pathways of other sensory inputs and the thalamus kind of like deciphers what's actually happening or what sensory input is there. And then it hits the cortex. So like a visual disturbance doesn't actually mean there's anything wrong with your eye. We know that. It's just like the brain misinterpreting something like a pain signal as your vision going dark or blurry or squiggly, or whatever it is you see as your aura. And so there's not necessarily anything different with someone that has a migraine with aura as far as like how we would interact with them or treat their symptoms. Fun fact feels like the wrong term here, but for lack of a better term, fun fact, there have been several times where in treatment and finding pressure on a joint that's kind of sensitive, like patients will actually experience that aura just for a brief period of time while we're applying that pressure. And then as soon as we release the pressure, the aura goes away. And so we're touching their neck, right? And the brain is perceiving that as like, oh, this is the aura. And so to be able to reproduce an aura is telling us that it's really just a sensory input. Like the brain just thinks something's happening when really we're not. And we're not damaging anything. We're not hurting anything. We're just encouraging the joint to move. And it hasn't moved in so long. It doesn't really want to move. And that's its response. And I'll say it's kind of fun because we know we're hitting on the thing that needs to be hit on, and that patient should improve and get better. So any thoughts there?
Not really. I was going to say just that if they happen to be in our clinic, we can have them start painting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And maybe their paint, they can continue with the impressionist painting style, but they don't have to have the aura with it.
That's true. I was gonna say.
Who knows what their capacity could have been, right?
Yeah, I think so as well. So the rest of these on my list are more just kind of kind of interesting. I don't know if there's necessarily anything to go over as far as clinical, but Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, third U.S. president, famously suffered from headaches. They talked about kind of the dark room sort of thing. He had, he could write a little bit in the morning, and then he basically had to spend the rest of the day in a darkened room. So I thought that one was pretty interesting. Woodrow Wilson, another U.S. president, was actually told, we talk about physical activity a lot, he was actually told to play golf for his headaches. So I thought that was kind of a pretty, looking back, a pretty good diagnosis from his doctor that he needed to go play golf, I think every other day or every Sunday, I can't remember. Charles Darwin, famous for his theory of natural selection by evolution by natural selection. He almost missed his wedding due to headaches. And actually, we could talk a little bit about this one just from an interest standpoint. They think a lot of his headaches were due to anxiety, kind of mental health. He talks about having a really overbearing father and sort of being a bit of a, nervous personality, maybe a little bit agoraphobic. I don't think that's necessarily a diagnosis he's been given, but being really kind of an anxious personality. So we could talk a little bit about the effect of mental health on headaches. Could be really interesting.
Yeah. I it's kind of, I guess part of it would be like a chicken or the egg, right? Like not everyone with, I guess, mental health, problems, feels like there's a better way to say that, but like things like anxiety, like not everyone that has anxiety would also have a headache or a migraine. But it definitely doesn't help. Right. And so, if we're interacting with someone that has a high level of anxiety, there's probably a level of like education, and how we approach the situation that would be appropriate and helpful. And I would say that it's rare to find a situation where someone's mental health is enough of a barrier where they can't find relief on the physical side. Like I said, because it doesn't mean that's causing your headache or your migraine. But yeah, that's where I would land there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, yeah, I think just one thing I've seen is it does tend, and I believe the research indicates this, is that you do tend to perceive pain a lot higher when you're suffering from like anxiety and any sort of mental health illness. You just tend to be a lot more kind of hypervigilant, and a lot more sensitive to pain. So it can impact your pain tolerance or your pain perception as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. What, you got a few more there?
Just a couple fun ones. So Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were opposing Civil War generals, both migraine sufferers, or headache sufferers at least. There's a really funny story that the day that the Confederacy surrendered, Ulysses S. Grant was in his tent trying to get over a migraine, and apparently as soon as the messenger came and said that the South had surrendered, the headache just went away, which I thought was kind of funny. I don't know if it's true, but it sounded like a pretty funny story. The thorn in the side that St. Paul mentions in the Bible I saw one source that said that might have been migraine. I really don't know where they're coming from on that, because I feel like that could be just about anything, but possibly a biblical reference to migraine. Karl Marx had migraine. Sigmund Freud wrote 2 treatises on migraine that are largely disproven now. Let's see. Anne Frank mentions headaches in her diary. Famous, obviously, the Diary of a Young Girl. And then John F. Kennedy was a famous headache sufferer as well. So kind of just a bit of a rapid fire list. But it was really important to me when I was going through this project. I was kind of looking at this list and I was just thinking, I feel like when you have a headache or a migraine, it's so easy to feel so alone. You feel like no one gets you. You feel like, you're wasting your life just sitting in your room in the dark. And I really hope that as our listeners kind of listen to this, they realize that one is you are not alone in this suffering. And there's many, many people that you share. I mean, the list of celebrities is dozens long. The list of historical figures is dozens long. You are very much not alone in suffering from headaches and migraines. And the other thing is that you can still live a super productive life. Some of these names are some of the biggest in history. You've got, presidents on there. You've got music. You've got famous artists. You can still live an extremely productive life, even though you do suffer with migraines or headaches.
Yeah. And I love that. Just the impact that these people were able to have on the world in spite of the symptoms that they were going through. And I hope that's an encouragement to the listeners. This is super interesting. I kind of had fun going through it. So thanks for doing the research.
No, it was, like I said, I love history. So it actually came from a question. We were in a treatment and I wondered if migraines were sort of a 21st century problem because we do spend so much time seated and hunched forward on our phones. So I started looking into it. It's like, nope, very much a historical problem that's been around, it seems, at least since biblical times, if not even probably before that, to be honest. But yeah, not a problem of our age.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Not just a problem of looking at our phones, sitting for too long, having desk jobs, that sort of thing. That's great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Thomas, for doing the research, being on the podcast. This was fantastic.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. So thank you all for listening to the Headache Doctor podcast, for tuning in every week. As always, share and send this podcast to anyone that you think would benefit from it. We're on a mission to educate and empower everyone, that means everyone, with headaches and migraines so that they can break free from a life of fear of their next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. We want to get people out of that cycle so that they can thrive in everything they do. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.